Good evening, and welcome back. I am your host, Father Vampire, and thrilled to present to you our next installment for Series 1, The Search for the Slavic Vampire of History. Okay, you ready? 'Cause tonight, we're going vampire hunting. So grab your shovels, stakes, crosses, garlic, and let's see what or who we can dig up. Though something tells me we might find our prey a bit more elusive than we think. Tonight's episode, Defanging the Blood-Drinking Vampire. Okay, have we all got our Vampire Slayer kits at the ready? Great. Of course, before we can stake a vampire, we first have to find him. And to do that, we've got to know what to look for. And that gets right to the heart of the matter. What is a vampire? Well, before we start to tackle that question, let's first take a look at the origins for some of the more popular vampire traits out there, such as, for example, intolerance to sunlight, casting no reflection, having fangs, pale skin, wearing goth clothing. As you've probably figured out, all these vampire traits are not found anywhere in Slavic lore or history, but instead come to us straight out of Hollywood. Okay, what about this one? Psychic feeding. The pranic vampire. This trait has grown in the past 50 years since its suggestion to become almost the most popular for the vampire here in the West. And yet, while not the product of Hollywood, it was nevertheless equally the product of imagination. Specifically, the imagination of one man, occultist Anton LaVey, in 1969. Obviously, being a 20th century term, there's no evidence for or connection with this trait as Slavic. It's not a vampire trait at all. In fact, none of these traits are. All of them are entirely fiction, without a shred of historical, much less scientific evidence for any of them. Now, there is one other trait, one other key trait we haven't yet discussed. Want to guess what that one might be? Here you go. Oh, Stephanie, what were you thinking? Okay, so with all these fictional traits out of the way, let's move on to the two most popular traits ascribed to the Slavic vampire. The two traits considered so primary to the vampire that they're found listed as part of its definition in pretty much every dictionary on the planet, as a reanimated corpse who rises from the grave to drink the blood of the living. So he is both a revenant and a blood drinker. A blood-drinking revenant, if you will. That's what the Western world believes the vampire to be, and we never question this. Not only that, we then take those two traits and use them to start dictating to other cultures what their myths are, and that they're vampires too. Even their ancient history isn't safe from us, as we've claimed to have found them in ancient Sumer, Egypt, Assyria, Greece, India, China. All of these and more, we've decided, are filled with vampires too. And all of it founded on this claim that vampires are reanimated, blood-drinking corpses who feed off the living. But just how well evidenced are vampires as such? Let's find out. Come on, get your stakes and mallets ready, 'cause we're hunting blood-drinking vampires now. and beginning with the first alleged account of such, dating to 1656 CE, with the death of one Jure Grando, a common villager living in Kringa, Croatia, who allegedly haunted his village thereafter, and is considered the first case of an actual vampire as defined here in the West. Looking rather like Uncle Fester from the Addams Family. Here we have Jure Grando, who supposedly returned after death to have sex with his widow, and then for the next 16 years was blamed for causing unknown illnesses and deaths in the village. And how did he do all this? Was he attacking people and drinking their blood? Nope. All he did was knock on people's doors at night. No, that's it. He supposedly knocked on their doors, and somehow the people therein died. Yet he was never seen by anyone, and no blood drinking was ever claimed. Also, he was never even called a vampire. As we learned in episode 1, the term itself had been around for centuries prior to that, yet instead he was called a strigoi, or strigon, or strigun. Doesn't mean vampire at all, now does it? Curiously, instead it means witch. The mysterious deaths are claimed to have stopped only after they exhumed the corpse and decapitated it. And that was the end of it. Okay, so did Mr. Grando fit the definition of a revenant? Arguably, yes. But was he a blood-drinking revenant? A vampire? No, he wasn't. There's not a shred of evidence he ever was. Sorry, vampire hunters, no blood-drinking vampire to stake out here. Okay, now let's move forward, fast-forwarding to about 50 years later to the actual Slavic Serbian vampire panics in that neighboring country that sparked everything that has followed, and that lasted from 1725 to about 1755, a short 30-year period, beginning with the most celebrated of these cases, Petar Blagojevich and Arnold Paule. Now, in all such cases, they were called vampires, and, as also with Jure Grando, they were blamed for unexplained illnesses and deaths. However, there were no accounts of anyone being physically attacked, and again, no blood drinking was ever claimed. Yet it was during these Serbian panics that the vampire's blood drinking trait was first claimed. You see, as more and more of the recently deceased were accused of being vampires, more and more of their corpses were being unearthed and mutilated. And people began to notice what seemed to be blood seeping from the corpses' mouths. And their bodies appeared to be bloated. And when the chest was punctured by a wooden stake, what seemed to be blood came gushing out, often accompanied by a groaning sound. And thus it was assumed these corpses must have drank blood from the living. And voila! The blood-drinking vampire was born. Now, as this new belief spread throughout South Slavic lands, the hysteria regarding vampires grew exponentially along with it, until almost anything bad that happened was blamed on the recently deceased. Did your crops fail, perhaps? Or your livestock get sick? Was your house vandalized, or a prized possession suddenly somehow went missing? Well, obviously, a vampire was to blame. Time to start digging up the corpses and mutilating them. The hysteria became so disturbing to the clearer-thinking Slavs in the area that they complained to their Austrian authorities, those then ruling South Slavic lands, and word got back to Empress Maria Theresa, who assigned her own personal physician, Dr. Gerhard van Swieten, to investigate the matter personally. So Dr. van Swieten assigned 2 of his physicians to accompany him in the investigation, Dr. Johannes Gasser, professor of anatomy, and court physician Christian Vabst. And together they traveled to Croatia and Serbia and were shocked by the paranoid insanity they encountered, as graveyards were found looking like plowed fields. The corpses found lying about, mutilated and decapitated, some burnt, as claimed vampire hunters, sorcerers, and local Christian clergy profited greatly from creating all manner of rituals using their respective talismans and symbols to supposedly ward off the vampire, thus giving birth to the notion of the vampire as abhorring the Christian cross. Now, it was into these Serbian villages that Dr. Van Swieten and company methodically entered and began investigating and documenting everything they found, before later returning to Austria disgusted and disheartened, understandably concluding that all the panic was the result of vain fear, superstitious credulity, lots of imagination, and loads of medical ignorance. And it was this scientific assessment that thankfully resulted in the Empress herself issuing her 1755 decree on vampires, forbidding the Church from encouraging such insanity and prohibiting any further desecration of graves and corpses. Thus was ended the Serbian vampire panics, with the belief in blood-drinking vampires medically debunked. Though, of course, this didn't stop what happened next in the West. For by then, Western journalists had had a field day, publishing their sensationalized reports on the Serbian vampire far and wide, with fiction writers right on their heels, feverishly creating their own tales involving them. And thus was incited the Gothic vampire fiction explosion that soon followed, beginning, ironically enough, with Dr. Gerhard van Swieten's own Vampirismus, a bitingly sarcastic recounting of his Serbian adventures. Then followed the long list of classic vampire fictions, from Polidori's The Vampire, A Tale, through Varney the Vampire's many volumes, and on until we arrive at the wonderfully delicious French lesbian-leaning vampire classic Carmilla, ultimately culminating, of course, with Stoker's eponymous vampire, Dracula. And since then, we've all continued to enjoy all that Hollywood and everyone else has created and continues to create to this day. All of it fictional tales told not by the actual Slavs, whose vampire it was, but instead all emanating from the fertile imaginations of Western storytellers having no knowledge of or experience with Slavic history or its many disparate cultures, religions, and beliefs. Now, has modern science and medicine done anything since the 18th century to help either validate or discredit Dr. Van Swieten's debunking of the Slavic vampire? Oh, yes. As one of the better examples, Dr. Paul Barber's masterful forensic re-examination, Vampires, Burial and Death, Folklore and Reality, makes absolute mincemeat of the entire Slavic vampire fiasco, showing all the vampire evidences that were claimed at those times were nothing but classic examples of natural decomposition common to the human body. As example, the corpse's limbs and joints found loose and no longer stiff. That was just simply because rigor mortis is temporary. The corpse appearing full of blood, that was just due to the natural liquefaction of internal organs. In other words, the organs liquefy in decomposition into a reddish-brownish sludge resembling partially coagulated blood. Thus, the blood observed seeping from the mouth and other orifices is due to this process. And what seemed new skin and still growing fingernails are also the result of decomposition as well. And naturally, as decomposition occurs, the corpse is going to bloat with internal gases building up, making the body appear plump, which when punctured, for example, as with a wooden stake, this results in sounds escaping as the gases do. Whoopee cushions work on the very same principle. Doesn't mean they're alive. However, Dr. Barber goes much further than this in his debunking of these claims, pointing out how one of the most celebrated of Slavic vampire researchers, a Serbian Slav himself, Tatomir Vukanovic, found not a single instance of actual blood drinking mentioned or claimed. Thus, he concludes, This supposed trait seems to be merely a folkloric means of accounting for two unrelated phenomena: unexplained deaths and the appearance of blood on the mouth of a corpse. However, Dr. Barber doesn't stop there. He goes on to point out that folkloric vampires are never caught in the act. When they are caught, if at all, they're found lying peacefully in their graves, as corpses tend to be, or in their invisible form are chased down by a sorcerer. In other words, vampires were never actually seen by anyone, nor was anyone ever actually attacked by one. You know, it's almost as if they were imaginary. And Dr. Barber is not the only doctorate-level Slavic expert to conclude this. Dr. Sabina Ispas, one of Romania's greatest Slavic ethnographers and folklorists, also confirmed this in her address before the 2000 World Dracula Congress that, indeed, there are no bloodsuckers in Romanian tradition. And for those who might not know, Transylvania, one of the greatest homelands of the Slavic vampire, is in Romania. Okay, so that's great for South Slavic lands, but what of Northern and Eastern Slavic lands? What of Russia, the homeland of the first actual vampire in recorded history, and my namesake, Father Vampire, whose very words written in 1047 CE I presented in our first episode? For that, let me quote from the writings of Dr. Dmitry Konstantinovich Zelenin, declared one of the greatest collectors and students of Russian folklore, and also one of the most exceptionally erudite, broad-spectrum anthropologists and Slavicists. According to him, the idea of the bloodthirsty vampire has penetrated from Western Europe to Ukraine and Belarusia. To the great Russians, it is unknown. And there it is. As Dr. Zelenin lays out clearly for us, the journey of the blood-drinking vampire from beginning to today is now complete. It all began in South Slavic lands, thanks to medical ignorance and superstition, traveled from there into Western Europe via sensationalized journalist reports, became popularized throughout Western Europe by the entertaining tales of fiction writers and later Hollywood, and then via that means spread east back into Slavic lands and on further east into Russia, the actual homeland of the first real vampire of recorded history, almost 1,000 years earlier. And ever since, Slavic lands have been forced by our pop cultural contamination to increasingly reflect our fictional version of their historical vampire to turn a profit. When you go to Romania, Transylvania, all of those areas, and you see all of their vampire-themed locations, tours, events, and souvenirs, who's all that for? What language are the advertisements and marketing materials written in? How about the signs as well? That's right, because it's not for them. No, it's all for us. It's for Westerners because that's our vampire, not theirs. That's not the Slavic vampire of their culture, their history, because it's not their vampire. It's ours. And yet, despite all the evidences proving it, still here in the West, even academic vampirologists continue to have a real tough time accepting this. So invested are they still in our Western belief in the vampire as a blood-drinking revenant. One of these, a renowned vampirologist from Indiana University, Professor Felix Oinas, became quite incensed after reading Dr. Zelenin's conclusion that blood-drinking vampires came from us. In a scathing retort, he shot back, "Zelenin's position here is hardly tenable. There are clear indications that the beliefs in vampires have deep roots among the Slavs and obviously go back to the Proto-Slavic period. These beliefs are also well documented among the early Russians." Wow. That's not at all what Dr. Zelenin was saying. He didn't say The Slavic vampire wasn't real, only that our bloodthirsty ones weren't. So, as we have learned throughout this review of the historical and scientific evidences, the actual Slavic vampire of history, who was very real, never drank blood. All of the evidences soundly contradict any such possibility. Instead, as we have learned, blood drinking was assumed only after graves were exhumed and blood found on the corpses' mouths. Okay, so now wait a minute. As blood drinking wasn't found until only after the graves were exhumed, then that gives us a clue. Because that can only mean that the belief in vampires as revenants came before the false blood drinking claim. So why were vampires thought to be revenants? Why were they exhuming corpses in the first place? Now, this was a much tougher historical nut to crack, but crack it we did, and it was appropriately the research of yet another doctorate-level Slavic expert, Dr. Christopher Caius, that cracked it and finally put this historical mystery to rest, as it were. As he discovered, before Christianity, Slavs predominantly cremated their dead, in the belief that a person's soul would only be released with the burning of their body. You see, the pre-Christian Slavs didn't bury their dead, they burned them. Because, you see, for the pagan Slavs, if buried and not burned, then the spirit, the soul, our essence, if you will, remains forever trapped inside the body. And if disturbed either in life or after death, that essence could rise from the grave, either with or without the body, and cause mischief. Thus, as Dr. Caius continues, in a sense, the first vampire practices are a kind of byproduct, an accident, if you will, an unforeseen outcome in the cultural revolution forced on the Slavs by Christianity. Now it all makes sense. This is where the Slavic concept of and belief in revenants began. And surprisingly, not just with the Slavs. You see, as Dr. Caius continues, in Central and also Eastern Europe, the archaeological record shows an explosion of burials in the 7th and 8th centuries in which a stone is placed on top of bodies to keep the dead down. And that makes perfect sense, too, because this coincides perfectly with the Christianization of the Slavs in those areas at that time, ultimately culminating with the Russians' own Christianization in the 10th century. That's when burying the dead became mandatory. Thus, revenant beliefs naturally sprang from it. This fully explains why we find still to this day so many similar burials throughout Western Europe and into England, where we still occasionally find burials where stones were placed in the corpse's mouth or with a sickle or sword across the neck. All of these pagan precautions taken to prevent the corpse from rising from the grave as a revenant. Don't you see? These weren't vampire practices, but simple revenant beliefs common to all pagan cultures that were later forced into Christianity and its belief in the resurrection, thus necessitating burial. This is the foundation for all the great ghost stories we have from England to Russia and that have crossed the pond over here to America. None of this has anything to do with the Slavic vampire. However, specific to Slavic lands and foundational in part to what the actual Slavic vampire was, the next question I needed answered was this. As we know, the original Slavic vampire was not a revenant, but a real person. People, actually, like our father vampire. So this being the case, how did they slowly or perhaps suddenly become equated in Slavic lands with revenants? Might there be some trait a living person was claimed to have possessed that was later demonized, such that those possessing that trait would be thought likely to return from the grave? To answer that, I learned that in Christianized Slavic lore, a revenant was defined as a man or woman who died having been a witch or a heretic in life. Okay, so that was interesting, because we know Jure Grando was called a witch, not a vampire. Thus perhaps he had been suspected of being a witch while living, and thus was more easily considered a revenant after death. Yet the vampire moniker was not yet ascribed to revenants. So I kind of logged that away, and so should you, because this is going to hold unparalleled significance in a later episode. Okay, so let's continue with the heretic angle. Now, of course, the term heretic is purely a Christian one. It means someone who runs contrary to Christian church orthodoxy, nothing more or less. Such as, for example, someone who is considered blasphemous, or who died without baptism, or committed suicide. However, I also found mentions made in Slavic accounts of a very specific kind of claimed heresy that was considered especially damning, and that would almost certainly result in becoming a vampire after death. And that was if the person had been especially sexually active, or, as one Slavic source put it, a man who has been a great lover of women. Now, the incredible significance of this didn't hit me then, but it would, just as it will for you too. I can't wait to reveal all of this in later episodes. It truly is world-changing, not just where vampires are concerned, but for us all, and for our true potentials and future as a species on this planet. So where does all this leave us in our dictionary definition? That's right, in shambles, frankly. There simply is no evidence for blood-drinking revenants in Slavic lands, period. Thus, there is no foundation for vampires defined as such. This definition is incorrect. This definition is debunked. So, where does this leave all the so-called vampires found worldwide and throughout history? I mean, after all, they're being defined by that same debunked definition. Well, Sanguinarius.org best addressed this question, and as their reasoning was so impeccable in both its logic and eloquence, I'm going to pretty much quote it directly here. As they point out, here in the West, we established the notion that every culture has a form of vampire belief, that vampires were a universal, even archetypal human superstition buried in every body of myth, hidden in every holy book, lurking behind every fairy tale. And of course, we're dead wrong in this. Our folklorists managed this by taking each separate element and using it to qualify as a type of vampire absolutely anything, fitting even one aspect of that definition. Was it a supernatural being that drank blood? Or a revenant? Or perhaps something that pestered the living for sex? There's that sex thing again. Yeah, then they're all types of vampire. Never mind the complex histories and belief systems involved. They all got lumped together, and suddenly vampires included at least half of all the myths, legends, and folklore on the planet. Leave it to Western arrogance to have us thinking we have any right to dictate to other cultures what their own myths and beliefs really mean. As a perfect example of that arrogance, let's take one of the most well-known examples of another culture's supposed vampire. India's own creator-destroyer goddess, Kali. And why has she been declared a vampire by us, despite being a goddess and not a revenant? Oh, well, that's because she's a blood drinker, right? In fact, she isn't. We got that completely wrong. She doesn't drink blood at all. Instead, what happened was that on one occasion, way back in prehistory, she was forced to drink blood, not to satisfy some vampiric bloodlust, but instead to save all of humanity. You see, according to Indian mythology, this event occurred after she had fought and finally killed a powerful demon, Raktadbija, and I'm sure I didn't pronounce that correctly. And this demon had a magical ability. You see, every drop of blood that fell from his body would have transformed into a demon just like him, thus spawning millions of new demons she would then have had to fight and slay so as to prevent those demons from destroying all of humankind. So to prevent this, she was forced to drink all of this demon's blood, thus saving the world. And now you've heard the rest of the story. Now you understand the myth and its context, the full context of the blood drinking involved. Obviously, Kali is no vampire. She is a goddess who did what she had to do to save the world, to save us. And in that context, she is actually closer to the Christian Jesus as a world savior than anything even approaching a blood-drinking vampire. So, okay, let's take it closer to home with another supernatural monster we here in the West know well. Is the werewolf a type of vampire? Folklorically, they are very closely related. He's even Slavic, but not here in the West, where thanks to the underworld movies, we have come to view them as arch enemies to each other. However, unlike with Kali and all the other falsely identified world vampires, the werewolf shares not just one vampiric trait, but many. Like the vampire, the werewolf was originally human, and was turned when bitten by another such being. The werewolf also drinks blood, and yes, also eats flesh too, so as to sustain its unnatural life. And also adds to its community of werewolves by biting others and turning them as well. And like the vampire, it can only be killed by special means. Yet, is the werewolf a vampire? Would we ever mistake the one for the other? Of course not. Despite their very similar traits, we know from our intimate understanding and knowledge of each that they are not the same being. Yet we have the arrogance to blanket label other cultures' monsters about which we know nothing as being vampires. Okay, how about one more? The zombie. Is the zombie a type of vampire? And yet the zombie shares the same vampire traits as the werewolf, plus a couple more. For in addition to these same 5 vampire traits, the zombie, like the vampire, must also first die and then become a revenant. And then it remains an immortal revenant until or unless finally killed. Now that's 7 traits shared with the vampire. And yet do we consider the zombie a type of vampire? Would we ever confuse a zombie movie with a vampire movie? So then, why do we continue to confuse so many of the world's and history's supernatural beings with vampires? As should be obvious, they are no more vampires than is the werewolf or zombie. So sorry, my dear would-be vampire slayers, no blood-drinking vampires to be found anywhere. We can all put away our stakes and mallets. So is that it then? Is the inevitable conclusion that all vampires are fictional? Case closed? Well, we could, were it not for that very special 11th century church document we discussed, translated, and read in our first episode. The one written by Father Vampire himself, in his own words, by his own hand. Because regardless how discredited and debunked are all our fictional Western definitions for him, yet he's still there, a real Slavic vampire of history. And guess what? He's not going anywhere. So why have we still not found out who and what the real Slavic vampire is? As it happens, it was Indiana Jones and Sala who point out the obvious that everyone else has missed.
They're digging in the wrong place.
And they keep digging in the wrong place over and over and over again, because they keep trying to find the same false traits debunked 300 years ago. You know, it reminds me of that age-old joke of the man who went walking late at night and lost his wallet in an alley, yet insists on endlessly looking for it under a street light 2 blocks away, 'cause the light's better there. It's very simple. We've known since the 18th century that the vampire is not a blood-drinking revenant. Yet vampirologists keep pointedly ignoring and denying all the vampire evidences predating that period. To this day, they still refuse to cross that 1600 CE barrier, and therefore remain unforgivably clueless as to all awaiting us on the other side. As Sala summarized so perfectly, their problem has always been the same.
Bad dates.
Bad dates, indeed. They keep digging in the wrong place because they keep looking at the wrong dates. It's everything prior to the false demonizations of that period that reveal how real vampires went from being honorable, mortal humans to being falsely demonized as evil revenants. And all for possessing unique, even arguably supernatural traits, abilities, and capacities deemed heretical and even demonic by Christianity. That's fine. It's their loss and our gain. For had they focused instead on the 600 plus years prior to such demonization, they would have found, as did I, not only many other documented real vampires, but, believe it or not, families and entire villages and towns filled with vampires, as they truly were, as they undoubtedly still are, and with their true vampiric dark gift in full abundance. In this episode, we have successfully exhumed and defanged all the supposed bloodthirsty monsters of our own twisted Western imaginations, revealing them as entirely fictional. And thus, we are now finally prepared to punch through that carefully guarded 17th century barrier and continue on in our search for the Slavic vampire of history. With the next episode, Vampires, Vampires Everywhere. Thank you, and good night.